Well, we continue the story now as the Israelites have gone into exile and they're going to be there for 70 years, and then God is going to restore his people. So we have already looked at Jeremiah and Ezekiel and the prophets that announce that God's judgment was coming. They go into exile. We haven't looked at it, but you could read the book of Lamentations, which is going to describe what took place at this time period. But now we're really moving towards the last time of the Old Testament, the period of temple, which is really the last 100 to 130 years of the Old Testament. So the first thing I want to mention is you want to look at your maps, the casket empty maps, and we're now moving to the Persian time period, which Daniel had seen several kingdoms. This is the next kingdom with the Persian Empire and with King Cyrus, who is a very well-known Persian king. And you'll see from the map the extent of the Persian Empire. It really is quite remarkable. And what I want you to notice at this time is when God's people go back to Jerusalem, and if you see where Jerusalem is on the map, it's just it's quite a distance in terms of where they're going to. But Jerusalem is simply a small province of Yehud, it's called. It's simply a small province within a vast Persian Empire. The land that they have is much smaller than what they originally had during the days of David and Solomon. So really, this is a day of small things. I want you to also notice on the map we have the place of Babylon. We're also going to be looking at Susa coming up, because this is where Nehemiah is going to be in Susa. So you start to see what we call the diaspora, the spreading abroad of God's people. And there are going to be then two returns back to Jerusalem, one in 538 BC, the first return, and then the second one in 458 BC, which is when Ezra returns. So those are the two that we're going to be focusing on. And then we'll see the last period is going to be then Nehemiah, because he's going to go back to Jerusalem as well. So as we start this time period, I want you to turn to the last chapter of 2 Chronicles, because I want you just to notice that the story of Kings in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, the end of it is identical to what's in the first few verses of Ezra. And so that's going to be helpful for us to continue this narrative, where if you look at Chronicles 36, verses 22 to 23. 2 Chronicles 36, verses 22 to 23. It says, "Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus." And he's going to issue a decree allowing them to go back into Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah in Isaiah 44 and 45 had already spoken about the time that God would raise up Cyrus and he would be the restorer of the temple. And that's exactly what happens, because he's going to let God's people go back into Jerusalem to start rebuilding. And so look at then Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. "In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah." And so we start to see the same story. And then in chapter 1, we start to see the description of the return in chapters 1 and 2. I want you to be aware of, as you read through and study this final time period, that Ezra doesn't go back in the first return, even though you're reading it in the book of Ezra. He is not part of the first return. His return is recorded in Ezra chapter 7, and you will see this on the timeline that he's part of the second return back into Jerusalem. So we have the first return. I want you to notice that some of the leaders. We have Sheshbazzar, who's governor, but we also are going to focus on two key people, Zerubbabel and Joshua. You will find them both on the timeline under the final section of temple. Zerubbabel is in blue because he is the grandson of King Jehoiachin. And so this is absolutely critical, because God had made promises to King David that one of his sons would be on the throne. And remember, we saw with Zedekiah that his 70 sons were killed. Well, Jehoiachin, what happens to him, it's recorded in the end of Jeremiah and in the end of Kings. What happens to him is he's in Babylon and he has sons when he's in Babylon, and Zerubbabel is his grandson. And so that's why he's in blue. And you're also going to see in Matthew's genealogy, this is the genealogy that's going to be picked up in Matthew's genealogy, chapter 1. So, and you see on the timeline that Zerubbabel, there's an arrow leading toward Messiah. So they go back to Jerusalem. There is, they start building the temple, they build the foundation, and then they're going to offer sacrifices. But there is some conflict that happens with the people of the land, and they stop building the temple. And I want to pick it up in chapter 5 of Ezra, because in Ezra chapter 5 it says, when the prophets Haggai and the prophet Zechariah prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem, then Zerubbabel and Joshua began to rebuild the house of God which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. So I'm going to turn now to look at the prophets Haggai and Zechariah just briefly. But Haggai and Zechariah, God raises them up in 520 BC, and they are going to have a prophetic word give a prophetic word to the exiles who have now returned back to Jerusalem. So they're going to encourage them to rebuild the walls, but they're also given visions of something greater beyond the immediate temple, and which we often find with prophets. They speak to their immediate circumstances, but they're also going to be speaking and giving a word for something that goes beyond that. And that's exactly what we find in these prophets. I also want to mention, as we think about Haggai and Zechariah and this time period, is don't miss what else is going on. Because these two leaders here, Zerubbabel and Joshua, and both the prophets are going to speak directly to them, they have a significant leadership role at this time in terms of rebuilding the temple. Well, why is that important? It is important because Zerubbabel is from the tribe of Judah, and Joshua is the priest from the tribe of Levi. And so what you start to see in this time period is you see these two, Judah and Levi, working together harmoniously. And in fact, Zechariah is going to have a vision because he sees the days when those two offices are going to merge, and it's going to anticipate Jesus, who is the priest king. So there's wonderful, rich theology here at this time. So if you can turn to the prophet Haggai, it's a short prophetical book. I simply want to mention that he is going to give prophetic word to encourage God's people to rebuild Jerusalem, and there is a promise of God's presence dwelling in their midst. And he also promises that God's glory is going to be greater than the former glory. Now I want to turn to Zechariah, who's also prophesying during this time. He calls God's people to return back to the Lord. It is what we call kind of, their language is very eschatological type language. But don't be put off by that, because what's important here is he is going to be seeing a vision of the restoration of Zion, and he sees that God is going to dwell in the midst of his people. So in Zechariah chapter 2, he sees in verse 10, he says, "Sing for joy and be glad, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I am coming and I will dwell in your midst, declares the Lord." And then he also says this, and this is another theme in this prophetical book, verse 11 of chapter 2. "Many nations will join themselves to the Lord in that day and will become my people." Do you see what's going on here? There's a promise of God's dwelling with his people, and the nations are going to become part of the people of God. And that gets picked up in a later chapter. And he says, "Then I will dwell in your midst, and you will know that the Lord of hosts has sent me to you." What a wonderful prophecy. then there are several other prophetic visions being given. In chapter 4, we have this kind of picture of this golden lampstand, and we have these olive trees. And again, my point to mention it is, as you read it through, it is focusing on two anointed figures, Zerubbabel and Joshua, and these are going to be a symbol of something that is to come. Because at the end of chapter 6, we're going to see there's a vision being given there, and Joshua, who is from the tribe of Levi, has a crown put on his head. And so we find out that these two are going to build the temple, but they're also a prophetic symbol of what is to come, because ultimately Jesus is going to be the priest king. Chapter 8, we have other promises about Jerusalem being restored. And Jerusalem, in verse 13, instead of being a curse to the nations, Jerusalem's going to be a blessing to the nations. And God is going to save the house of Judah and the house of Israel. And then look at what happens at the end of chapter 8. Verse 22, so many peoples and mighty nations will come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem. So again, there's this vision of the multi-ethnic people of God. And then I'll just finish Zechariah with chapter 9. And remember that there is no king on the throne at this point, because kingship finished in 586. The line of Judah continues. But just listen to what Zechariah prophesies about something in the future. He sees great joy, chapter 9, verse 9. He says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Remember, this is a day of small things when the Persian Empire is ruling, and it looks like, what is God doing? Zechariah calls them to remember God's promises of old, and to remember he's in control and he has a plan. And this is where the climax of his plan. 9 verse 9, rejoice, O daughter of Zion. Shout in triumph, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and endowed with salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey. And of course, you know that passage that gets picked up with Jesus when he's entering into Jerusalem. What a wonderful, wonderful image that we have here 500 years earlier of that prophetic word. But also, just the next verse, this is what it says. He will speak peace to the nations, and his dominion will be from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. There is the expectation that this king, his rule will extend to the end of the earth. And that's exactly what happens in the end of the book of Zechariah. There's this vision that God will reign and he will rule over the nations. So wonderful prophecies. Then if we go back to Ezra chapter 5 and 6, what happens is that through the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah, they rebuild the temple. And this is recorded at the end of chapter 6. It says that the temple was completed in the 6th year of the reign of Darius. That's chapter 6, verse 15. That is dated to 516 BC. So we have the completion of the temple, and yet there is no sign of God's glorious presence filling it. Not like we saw in Exodus chapter 40 and in the temple when Solomon built it in God's glory. That's why you will notice the picture for this time period that there is no cloud, because Malachi is going to say that God is going to return, but something else has to happen first. Okay, we also have the second return with Ezra in chapter 7, where Ezra is going to, in 458 BC, he's going to return back to Jerusalem, and he is devastated with what he sees in Jerusalem, because he finds that God's people have been marrying the foreigners, and really the underlying thing is the concern about worshiping their gods. And so he is concerned about this. We have in chapter 9 then this incredible prayer of confession. Remember, Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people will humble themselves and pray and return to me. This is one of those moments where God raises up Ezra to bring about repentance among his people, because, again, he's going to focus on God's faithfulness with prayer and fasting and confession, and there's going to be a time of returning to the Lord, and people commit themselves to follow the Lord. Well, we're going to pick up Ezra in the next video as well, because Ezra will lead God's people during the time of Nehemiah in a wonderful prayer of repentance, as well as corporate repentance during this time. So encourage you to keep the timeline in front of you. We are just getting now to the last section on the timeline, covering the entire Old Testament, and we're looking forward now to the final stage of what's ahead.